BBC2, John's introduction to the Aberdassi set is not without its problems.
Scusi. Yes? Why lights? There are plenty lights. Hey, scusi. Yes, it's moving.
The truth is, Vernon can't escort me to the rugby club dance tonight when I'm due to present prizes or something, and I thought, well, what do you say, John?
It's impossible. There's talk. You and Mrs. Griffith Williams. Well, tread carefully is all I say. If you want the job, that is.
You're leaving me.
Vernon's not a director of Cambro Sudanese oil for nothing, you know.
I can do without threats, for God's sake.
Only fair to warn you.
That uncertain feeling is experienced tomorrow at 9:25 on BBC2. This is BBC2. The budget. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Honourable Nigel Lawson MP, speaks for the government.
The past few months have seen a quite extraordinary drama in the world's marketplace. The collapse in the price of oil was not only spectacular, it was also amazingly sudden. But most of all, it was a revelation about the British economy. You see, for years, people have been saying that our economy is dependent on North Sea oil. Well, half of the value of that oil, half of it, disappeared virtually overnight, with a loss of revenue to the government of something over £5,000 million a year. Now, if we'd really been an oil-dependent economy, that would have been a catastrophe. The pound would have collapsed, interest rates would have gone through the roof, investment plans would have been slashed. But instead, what happened? Virtually nothing. No crisis, no run on the pound, no scurrying to the IMF for an emergency loan. In fact, it's been business as usual. But to understand why we survived unscathed, just as we survived last year's 12-month-long coal strike, what you have to do is to look at Britain's extraordinary record of stability and growth over the past few years. It shows up in all sorts of different ways. Take our national output. If you look at Britain's output since 1970, you can see how it had ups and downs till the world recession of 1981. But since then, it's marched on to an all-time high. 5 solid years of sustained growth. And those last 3 years, since the 1983 election, include the whole of the coal strike. We just soared up through it. In fact, that growth in output has been even more remarkable than it looks there. You can see why by a comparison with our main European competitors. From 1973 to 1982, we were right at the bottom of the European growth table. In 1983, we were top, second in 1984, and in 1985, last year, there we were back on top again. In the past, whenever Britain has embarked on a period of growth, it's always ended in tears as a result of rising inflation. But if you look at the figures for inflation over the same period, you see that we've succeeded in preventing that too. We had that terrible inflation under the Labour government in 1975, and it was rising fast once again when we took over in 1979. We got it under control, and since 1983, we've had our lowest inflation rate for nearly a generation. And that combination of falling inflation with rising output has been the dream of British governments for 20 years. Now it is a reality. And one of the most dramatic illustrations of this success is the remarkable improvement in the productivity of our manufacturing industry. You can see here how we staggered along, climbing up and slipping back all through the 1970s. Now see what's happened since the end of the 1981 recession. It's just a simple graph, but it tells the story of a nation that is at last rediscovering its old industrial vigor and manufacturing skill. And on top of that, exports are higher than they've ever been in our history, and so is investment in business and industry. Britain today has all the signs of a strong and healthy economy. And that's why the sudden collapse in oil prices has had none of the effects that the doom and gloom merchants were prophesying. Of course, it's meant a big loss of oil tax revenue to the government. But as far as Britain's economy is concerned, the benefits of cheaper oil are just as important. And that's one reason why the economic outlook for the coming year is so promising. The only disappointment in the whole economic story is the distressingly high level of unemployment. And that's why the creation of new jobs, real new jobs, has to be a top priority, not just in Britain, but throughout the world. Because, of course, it's a worldwide problem, and solving it's a slow business. Even so, we are doing better than the rest of Europe in creating new jobs. Look at what's happened in the other main common market countries since 1983. In France, the number of jobs is down by almost 400,000. In Italy, up by 100,000. In Germany, up by less than 200,000. But in Britain, over 600,000 more people are in work. If unemployment hasn't yet come down, that's because new people have been coming onto the job register at least as fast as the new jobs are created. In my budget today, I was able to announce still more help for the unemployed. More help under the Enterprise Allowance Scheme for those out of work who want to start up on their own. A new worker scheme for youngsters looking for their first jobs. More places on the community programme for the long-term unemployed. And in future, every single one of the long-term unemployed will be helped to find a job under the new Restart scheme. I hope these schemes will help. But what really creates new jobs is hard work and enterprise. And that's why I've cut income tax, to provide everyone with a bigger incentive to give of their best. Not by much this year, only a penny in the pound. Falling North Sea oil revenues saw to that. But the better we do, the more there is to look forward to in the future. And I was also able to do something to help create the sort of society which we all want to see. A caring society. And that's why I've announced new tax reliefs to encourage giving to charity. And a responsible society. And that's why I'm making it possible for the first time for ordinary people to buy shares in British industry without having to pay a penny of tax on the proceeds. We've come a long way together in the 7 years since you first entrusted us with the job of governing Britain. But there's still a long way to go, and a lot to do. People are full of bright ideas for crash programs. But crash programs usually crash far sooner than their inventors intended. No, the way forward is through solid and steady growth, year in, year out. It takes persistence, and sometimes a bit of teeth gritting. And it doesn't often make the headlines, but it has won us steadily rising output and living standards with low inflation. And that's a prize which has eluded every other government for more than 20 years.
That was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Honourable Nigel Lawson MP. Tomorrow evening at 10:35, the Right Honourable Roy Hattersley MP will be speaking for the opposition, and on Thursday, the Right Honourable Roy Jenkins MP will speak for the SDP Liberal Alliance. On BBC1, in just over 15 minutes, coverage of the World Figure Skating Championships from Geneva. Here on 2, we have a budget night edition of Newsnight.
The Chancellor springs a surprise with a penny off income tax. But is there any real hope for the unemployed? Good evening. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has conjured up a modest cut in income tax and clearly hopes to do much more in his next budget, probably the last before the general election. But should Mr. Lawson have given more help this time directly to the unemployed? And what real hopes can they place in the government's enterprise culture? We'll be analysing the economic and political implications of the budget, and I'll be discussing the main issues with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, John McGregor, with the Shadow Chancellor, Roy Hattersley, and with the Liberal leader, David Steele.
In France, the Constitutional Balancing Act begins. The Socialist President invites the Conservative Chirac for talks, but so far nothing's been decided. David Sells will be reporting from Paris as the delicate process of political cohabitation gets underway. All that and the news both home and abroad.